overhead, we had the resolution which was adopted by the school board. Those of you who did not have the opportunity to watch the school board session, they were there until the wee hours of the morning, and this is a resolution which affects us directly in that the school board has agreed to conduct an analysis of the Fairfax County continuum of advanced academic services to ensure that current practices are aligned with the best practices in the K through 12 gifted education, and further move that the scope of the analysis is to be presented to and decided by the board on February 28th, 2013, and the report on the analysis is to be completed by June 30th. So as you can see, this is a very short timeline. The study is going to have to be very focused, and our opportunity to provide input is limited because they will decide on the scope before we have our next meeting. So tonight, what I'd like to do is spend 15 minutes or so having each table talk within themselves as to what they think the scope of that study should be, focusing on that its current practices are aligned with best practices in the K through 12 gifted education. So really looking at how this committee can provide recommendations to staff on some things that should be discussed within the context of that study.
I just wanted to.
Please do.
I'm sure everybody's tuned in and saw this motion adopted at 1:30 in the morning, right during the board meeting. But Dr. Horn and I will present the proposed scope of study during Monday's work session of the school board on February 11th from 1:30 to 3:30 if anybody's interested in attending. But I would ask you to really provide us with some feedback about how you would recommend that we focus that study, because the motion as adopted is so broad that it's very difficult to interpret what that means, and we will spend the 2 hours during the work session on February 11th with the board trying to interpret what that means and come to consensus about what the focus should be. So, kind of sort through your thinking in terms of, where you would encourage us to focus our time and effort in terms of meeting that charge.
Great. Sorry. Yes. Kira and then George.
Right, yeah.
Two
Two questions. One, can we also comment on how it's conducted, like who should be involved, how we contribute, or is that not on the table? And then, secondly, my main question is what was done in 2012 and how do we ensure this is different, because we didn't get what we wanted out of what we needed out of 2012, or we've evolved, or whatever. I mean, stuff has changed since the 2012 study, so how do we think about that differently?
I would suggest you put it in your comments. I have some definite feedback about how personally I would see things.
Okay.
So I would offer those as comments. My caution is that it is 8:30. We have 1 hour. And as Sloan mentioned, they're going on Monday. So what we would like to do at the end of this hour is actually have something that we can hand off and say, this is our chance as APAC providing feedback to both of you as you move forward.
Okay, so we can do a scope and a how or who gets involved or whatever.
Well, we can start with that, and then what we'll do is try to build a consensus in the last half hour.
Okay.
And so that's why I'm saying let's take 15 minutes per table to start that discussion, and so we can pass out these sheets. I would love to have us. Already. Or ideas that you would like to present, please go ahead and do that, but do that second so that we can focus our discussion initially on what the scoping is. We will capture your ideas, everybody has an opportunity to put those ideas forward, but we have a limited amount of time. And so,
Get ready.
warm up your fingers and start typing. I would like one spokesman from each table. Ideally, it's your scribe, unless somebody else is more appropriate. And I will ask you to try to get it through in about a minute and a half first. Okay? So, who would like to go first?
I'm standing.
Yay! We have our professor ready to present.
I want you to read this from wherever you are. These are, we put these in the form of the
Ladies and
question.
gentlemen,
So,
let's hear.
is the percentage/proportion of FCPS identified AAP comparable to school systems of similar scope like FCPS? Can the training of the teachers keep up with the number of new students and staffing issues associated with an expansion plan? And what would be a realistic pace of expansion? How many students, what is that critical mass, are required to guarantee a high quality and sustainable program? And what are the best practices in a level 4 program at the elementary level, middle school level? Asking about that too in terms of programmatic items, such as extracurricular math offerings, language offerings. And the last is, what stakeholders will you include in the study? Administrators, students, and that's kind of an et cetera. How many seconds?
That was good.
Yeah, if it's all right, just to proofread it, if I could, I can't remember. If I could just proofread
You could take this.
take those, and then I can pony them to you when I'm done.
Yeah, but what we're hoping to do tonight is every table will present, and then we're going to try to reach a consensus
At 9 o'clock.
at 9 o'clock, or a little after 9, across all of the tables. This is where we have consensus, and then there may be areas that, it was a generic posted paper. It worked. So then we'll go there. Okay, so.
That's what I'm saying, yeah, I'll take those with me, do it tomorrow, and then Tony and Carol.
Excuse me, it's teach tomorrow.
With permission of original.
Okay, Tara, you want?
Sure. I wrote bigger. I have other stuff on the back, so hopefully you can actually read it, because I put the other stuff on the back. Bigger isn't necessarily better. We love your questions. You went a different way. We took a step back and said, hang on. We got a short amount of time. What can we realistically accomplish? We think there was a request at the table, slow down, okay? And I think that plays out in what we said. We want to understand the overall vision and the clear strategy for the continuum. That's what we've been charged with, that's what that says. We want to understand what the continuum looks like for advanced academic services. We had some questions. What's the objective? Who do we hope to serve at each level? Who's included? What's the specific measurable goal? How do we know if we're doing anything? This is probably best practices, because we had that a lot. Then the second part was we want to be able to define the terms for each service and how each fits into the continuum. For example, level 4, local versus center, center versus center, very confusing. How's it differentiated? Let's step back and really think this through. And I think it keeps getting lost. Okay. The third point was to evaluate the consistency and delivery across the county versus best practice, but it's also, the best practice would be obviously outside the county as well, okay? Secondly, define explicitly, what does success look like? I'm not sure I can articulate that clearly. I can give you an example for my situation, I can't articulate that clearly. And then how do we know if this works, right? That's what we're trying to do. We need to evaluate that both within the county, and we need to look outside. And we don't have to go far, that's the nice thing. Montgomery has a great program, but there are others that are really good. We can do that, comparable schools in the county as well. Is Belvedere, that's my school center, doing as well as Haycock? I have no idea. Are we offering the same thing? I have no idea. I can tell you we're offering something different from our local level 4s, but I can't tell you whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. Then define specifically how each level is different from each other, and including their curriculum, the examples, etc. And I realize I can read, and I've seen that presentation a gazillion times, and we talked about this. It's still not clear. It's not at a level of specificity that we understand, and I can tell you that there's very little differentiation that is visible between, in particular, 2 and 3, but also 3 and 4. And we need to understand, what does that mean? And it gets even more important at the middle school level. It doesn't feel like we have 4 levels anymore. And at high school, where is it? What does that look like? And that's part of our charge. So, and that's, I think, something that we've learned. So that's kind of, we said, hang on. If we're slowing down, let's take this opportunity to really think about that. And you don't want the other options until later, correct, Karen? That would just go?
You can go ahead and do that.
Okay.
Present the other options.
Okay.
But just realize that it's
I'll
going to
do
be
that.
2 parts.
Okay. I'll turn over my letter. Who should be involved was the other thing, okay, in terms of how the study's conducted. We believe an external facilitator or subject matter expert, somebody who has to be not just a facilitator, but somebody who's an expert in this, in gifted ed evaluation. We had some disagreement on this. We would like to see others besides Dr. Van Tasselbacke. I probably slaughtered her name, I apologize. As one of the options, either in addition to or separate from. Why? Because we're thinking, at least among the group, is what about a fresh eye? What about a fresh eye? Not because there's anything wrong. Do we need a fresh look? The second is we need to involve a significant portion of the community on the task force. Last night I happened to be looking. It's a lot of there was very limited community involvement. That was a huge issue for so many people this fall. We have an opportunity to address that. So why not? And really think about former teachers. They can speak freely. There's no issue. You know, we get their opinion. They've had time to ruminate and kind of get some perspective on it. They probably have seen other things since, so they could be really, really valuable in that. And make sure we've got some parents in there, both level 2, level 3, level 4. It doesn't need to be all level 4 people. So that's as far as we got on that part. But we wanted to be as attentive to the how as to the what. That was us. Thank you.
Okay, this table, please. Okay, good. You were not the scribe. Oh my. You're better than
What we're really looking for is a statement of scope, because we thought about this as being comparable to a market study. Whether you're talking, which is fine-tuned for educational issues that with problems that we're trying to address. So really the process should be the same regardless of whether you're analyzing what best practices are in natural gas distribution or AAP in Fairfax County. So we took a step back and said, let's look at what our statement of scope is and start with asking some basic questions. What do we want people to do? I think that's what Karen was trying to have us focus on in this session, but we were naughty and forced us to look at other things too. Who should do it? I think there was some other interest in the room about that too. Maybe there is in some of the other tables. And you know, we all recognize that this is a very tight time frame. 6 months for a market study is entirely doable, so long as you have a good team of people working on it together who are committed to meet the goals and perform quality work. And who your project manager is or your team leader is really critical to be able to pull it together. So we want to be able to succeed. We don't want to fail, so the right team really has to be put in place. And we talked about the goals, is that, you know, whatever we do, it needs to be an objective analysis of data that's gathered externally, best practices, what are the best practices in other school districts in the U.S., and also outside of the US, not the whole world. I think we can identify pretty quickly the targets that we want to look at. But, you know, we're constantly measuring our performance in STEM relative to other countries, so it doesn't make sense just to look at our own backyard. We need to look at what people are doing in other areas as well. So you start externally, gather data, and at the same time, concurrently, so you're not slowing down your process, you gather data internally. I understand that there's a lot of information available in Dr. Horn's office and Dr. Presidio's office. Look at what we have internally, but also making sure that we supplement it by perhaps doing some type of a survey of current students, current parents, current teachers, former teachers, and students that have exited our program, not just 1 year from now, 1 year ago, but maybe 5 or 10 years if we have a way of reaching these people so that we can truly see if over the long term we're being successful in what we're doing. So that was our report.
Which of these two tables wants to go next? Okay, we're perfect, thank you.
Want me to do it?
We were more focused, I guess, and not looking so much at the big picture. And we started with the thing that I heard the school board saying over and over again is this program has expanded 300% in the last few years. So part of what we think needs to be in scope is the selection process, how we're selecting students, are the tests appropriate, how have those tests been validated, and how are the cutoff scores done, and is it a moving target? So we thought the whole selection process should be part of that. Then the issue of equity. The community keeps talking about equity. Well, what does equity mean? We've heard from some people think equity means geographic location, providing a school in their pyramid. Other people think equity means what the center looks like and the makeup of the center. So we need to define equity and consistency of program. Is everyone across the county getting the same quality of program and so forth? So we need to compare that. Training of teachers was a big issue last month. So what is the professional development? How are we addressing that? How are teachers meeting it? And so that needs to be in the scope somehow. And then critical mass has been the overriding theme throughout is how many kids make up a center for each of the different levels. So, okay.
That up.
So going last, a lot of our ideas have already been identified, but we're also talking about how the school board members said there's been a huge growth in the program, and so we think the study should include a study of the identification and eligibility, making sure that special populations are identified, as well as focusing in on the 300% growth. We wanted a look at our 4 levels of services and whether they match the needs of the identified students in comparison to the best practices around the country, especially in my own opinion with the emergence of the local level 4. So when is a local level 4 appropriate for what needs student? When is a true center appropriate for other students? And we also identified the consistency of countywide programs. They should find out how does the consistency compare now? What kind of communication or information sharing practices can be put into place to improve consistency across the county? And we had a few thoughts on the process as well. We thought that the study should be conducted by a broader group, including stakeholders across groups, parents, teachers, retired teachers, students. Also, an impartial consultant should facilitate it. Also, we thought it might be best to open it up to someone who wasn't involved in the previous study to get a fresh start. reporting the finding kind of throughout the process, not just after everything was completed, and having a very transparent process with a report to produce, not just findings, something that shows the problem that was addressed, the way it was addressed, and the evidence that was looked at, so that everybody can feel comfortable in the results of the finding. And as a kind of a concurrent process, there seemed to be a lot of issues about data quality, so we thought that this opportunity could be taken to review the data internally and make sure that any decisions are based on science.
These are generic, so if it falls down, I'm sorry. This is great. I actually think that there is a lot of consensus across the room, which is what we were hoping to achieve. The question I had is, how do we want to do this? Do we want to go ahead and build consensus now? And then if we have a comfort zone with it, then we can go ahead and forward it to both. Now, Carol, I need your help on this. We send it to you in Sloan, and then you'll incorporate it or take it as inputted before your presentation on Monday.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be nice if we had some bullets. We could just share this is what APAC said.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how about if we work on putting together a consolidated bulleted piece, and what I'm going to do. Who's got? Carol, is there a word processing program on this? Yes.
Is there a reason we wouldn't want to also, like, I know the school board seemed to really appreciate when we sent them our comments directly, and they referred to that a lot. So if we have some consensus on a few thoughts, wouldn't it make sense to send that to the school board also?
We can send it as concurrent.
Both, yeah, okay. I just wondered if there was a reason that it.
No, it's just that we've been asked to provide input to.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
That was a nice little picture. You know, it seemed like maybe we'd want to.
Here, no, I think that's perfect.
Send it both places, okay.
Okay, great, thank you. They're all used. All six of them. Can I just try throwing out what I've heard as consensus points, okay? There are areas of what is the overall continuum of services that we're providing? And a question as to, and actually, let me backtrack a little. What I'm going to try to do is break it out into the same way I've asked you all to break out in the tables. What is the scope of the study, what the study should look at, and then process issues as two separate areas. Okay? Questions regarding the identification process.
I want to split mine.
Can you plug yours
You want to
in?
drive up there?
Yeah.
That would be great.
That was a twofer.
Okay. So I can multitask, but not with my computer. Okay. So basically what I've heard from you all, and please correct me because I'm trying to regurgitate, is there are questions over the terminology used and what is the overall continuum of studies that we provide here in Fairfax County. And that is both a issue of terminology and what the terms mean, as well as a question of what it actually means as far as the specifics associated with the program and whether there is consistency of the continuum of the program across the town. So the experience you get in McLean may not be the exact experience, but is it a comparable service experience that your child would receive in South County or in other areas of the county? we all agree on that as being.
I think even that as well as sort of what the goal of each level, I don't know, I liked that terminology.
The goal
Yeah,
of each
describing what is it and what is our goal with this level, like what
I actually, I don't know if it's helpful, Karen, you can forgive me, but I heard a few categories.
Yeah, well,
where,
that's,
and I think you're right on that, but I think it's, I mean, there's the overarching goal, what the heck is this thing, what are we trying to achieve, is it measurable, do we know what success looks like? There's the, within each continuum, each level,
each
along it,
level.
what is it? What is the specific goal, who's it intended to achieve? Then
And it's
is it
almost a
delivered?
matrix, because it's got to be, what is the goal at the elementary school level?
Correct.
What is the goal at the
Exactly.
middle school level? And what is the goal at the high school level?
And then, yeah, and then do they fit?
And
Is
do,
it
so
natural question?
here's the goal, and now let's measure whether we're achieving that goal. And are we achieving that goal across the county?
And externally
And
versus
externally.
external, I mean, we said we had both, there was country versus, or internationally.
Well, but that's the next thing. So in defining the goal, we want to use best practices. And the best practices that we want to look at are our national best practices, which are readily available, and I presume would be good consultant to pull from the National Association of the Gifted, from academia.
I would actually think that what a lot of us said was not necessarily national, but comparable. I think there's a difference between national best practice and comparable best practice.
Okay.
So you're saying, look at counties that are similar to
Yeah.
ours, that have similar makeup to ours?
Yeah.
Are we achieving?
And if you
Are we
average the
achieving-
plains of Nebraska with Fairfax County, I'm not sure that averaging is going to work. I mean, I think if it would make most sense to go with best practices in similar areas.
I disagree with that.
I think if we're looking at how well the county is performing, we're looking at how well the county is performing across the country. You're right, there's a difference in how maybe Nebraska's doing and what they're measuring, but there shouldn't, and that goes back to consistency. Are we providing a consistent program throughout the county? Are we providing a program that is comparable to what the rest of the country is providing, or even as
Well,
what
I
the
think
national
we
best
want-
practice is saying we should.
I actually think that Fairfax County wants to provide better than.
I would argue the
Yes.
best in the country
The
as
best,
opposed to comparable.
Yeah, and that's
Which
why.
I think is what you're saying, and I think
Is-
I think
we need to say that.
We want
versus
to
the
be-
best of what is offered.
So,
That's what I'm saying as well. When you say national,
Look, the argument has been that Fairfax County is full of smart people, so of course, 22% of our students were like, where we going? So, it makes sense that we've had a 300% increase. But we don't know that we're like, where we going?
yeah, so where are the best practices? And so that's the question is, how do we compare to the best practices? And the question underneath that, and that's maybe part of the process, is the best practices to be looked at should include our national best practices, our comparable peers' best practices, be it domestic or international. Does that work?
Yeah.
For example, the OECD
Yeah.
does stuff. Okay, that's fine. Try it. Okay. Drew does it. Okay. So, we've got our, now, what are our, how do we define criteria for success?
How do we define success?
How do we define success? So what's our success criteria? And then how do we actually measure against those criteria? Because that's the key part. We can set criteria, but how are we achieving those goals?
And I would argue at, not just overall, but at each level.
At each level and
Within our
geographically.
And, yeah, so for all those.
Okay. And we've already talked about the specificity at the different levels. And what do our delivery models look like? Okay. And then we raised the issue of data collection, but I think that's also a scoping issue, a process issue. And the question on the data collection is, what exists internally already? And can it be validated? Is that correct? Okay. And secondly, what additional data do we need? And how can we best achieve it by surveying possibly our students, parents, alumni, former teachers, and existing teachers?
The data is always an issue in all of these things, and I'm okay with understanding the limitations of the data if that's clear and that we can extrapolate from. So, I mean, that's something else. If we can't get it, I'd like to know this is what we have, this is why.
And this is where the delta.
These are the holes. This is where the data doesn't tell us what we need to do. Yeah. Because I think that's part of the problem. This is just getting confusing.
Another major area for study is the identification of students for each of the delivery models. And we want to make sure it's different delivery models because we have our children identified for various levels. I didn't sit at the table, but as a person up here, I would like to take a little bit of license and say, and how we move children between identification levels. Because one of the things that is pretty clear in the studies is that kids do move between levels. And question of equity of access as part of that identification. And that includes our underserved populations, which may include those that are underserved being not only minority, free and reduced lunch, twice exceptional, and ESL.
Can I suggest that we frame that as a question, or what do we want that to do? Because you guys, I forget which one had the equity thing, but there was a very well, I think it was you guys. There was more to it than equity. I think you had a very specific question. What do we mean by it?
Geographic versus.
How is it defined, and how does that, what are the implications of that definition?
Yeah, because
It's not just
different communities feel very differently about equity.
Instead of equity of access, I put, quality. Or consistency, quality.
Well, I would do that as the second one. That's not the same thing.
I'm just looking at what.
Quality and what of access?
Quality and consistency of programming across the region, or across the county.
across the county, by
And-
level, by.
Across the district and by different levels. And
Specific to
level.
the proposed expansion.
You're, up there, you have different focus on underserved population. What does that mean?
He's got three
Think about
thoughts in his head simultaneously trying to type.
Then we have an issue of, which one is,
Yeah.
hold on.
What was your,
You have different focus on underserved populations.
yeah, what's that mean? Okay.
I think
I have no idea.
You're good.